Good morning, everyone. I know most of the people in this room, but to those I don't, I'm Mike Simons. I'm the dean here at St. John's Law School. My job with respect to this conference is very simple. It's to welcome everyone and kick things off. My perspective as dean with regard to the symposium, but more generally the Intellectual Property Law Center, is that this center, like all of our centers, plays a really important role in the life of the law school. And what centers do is bring together faculty, students, the practicing bar, and the academy in a way that enriches everyone. And that's what's happening here today. So our IP law faculty, Jeremy Sheff, and Eva Sabatnik, our students, the fellows of the center, students of the law review, all coming together with, in this case, scholars from all around the country. To watch them exchange their ideas, to engage in a scholarly dialogue about important issues in IP law. And that's an important role that the center can play for the academy and, from my perspective, in a really important way for our students. So as dean, my job is to help make that happen, largely by providing the funding. And the work gets done by the faculty and by the students and by the scholars who are here. So I want to welcome everyone to what should be an exciting day. Thank our faculty, Jeremy and Eva, for helping to organize this. Thank our students, the center fellows, the law review staff, particularly Elizabeth and Tom and Katie and Erin for the leadership role they've taken in running the law review over this year and next year. And especially thank our panelists who've come from all over the country to share their ideas with us, and wish you all the best for a wonderful day. So thank you. Jeremy, it's all yours.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, and I'm going to second Mike's thanks for everybody who has helped bring today together, including the students who have been working on this, Alicia and Mike, and the law review students, and particularly Liz and Rose, and also our professional staff who you guys have interacted with if you came here from far away, Claire and Nancy and Jen, who have all been very, very helpful, and we're grateful to them as well. So, welcome everybody. Our program for today is a symposium on values, questions, and methods in intellectual property, and our first panel deals with the values part of that set of issues. So our panel here today is a group of esteemed scholars who have thought very hard about deep fundamental issues underlying the intellectual property system that most of our students learn about in some fashion in the Intro to Intellectual Property course, the questions of why we have intellectual property at all, and why we think that it needs to be the subject of legal regulation. And some of those debates are familiar. The debate between utilitarians and moral rights theorists, for example, and a more modern and refined version of that debate has been engaged in of late by two of our panelists, Rob Burgess and Mark Lemley. But beyond that familiar debate, there are also lots of other values that can be identified in intellectual property systems and in alternatives to intellectual property systems, as well as values and voices and perspectives that don't always get heard in the more familiar debates. In particular, we've seen those interests represented in the work of our panelists, Professor Bartow and Professor Kapcynski. And I'm glad that we are starting today with an opportunity to hear some of those broader perspectives brought to bear on the more familiar debate and see how we can start talking about these things in a broader and more integrated way. And I'm really looking forward to it. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way and turn things over to our first speaker, Professor Ann Bartow. And if you can stay where you are, if you'd like to be here, let it be. The mic will be up.
another topic, and I decided to write something about gender. So I was just really pleased, and I thought that's a good statement of sort of his view of bringing a lot of views to the table. So here we are. So we talk about intellectual property. I know probably the students are beyond this level of simplicity, but we always talk about patenting ideas and then copyrighting the expression of ideas. So ideas and expression of ideas. Well, I live my life assuming that women have as many ideas as men. But what we don't have anywhere nearly is as many patents. We probably hold, I would guess at this point, at least within the last few years, my guess would be, and it's just a guess, that women probably hold more copyrights than men. But we don't hold the really profitable ones. So men definitely have drastically more patents. But as far as copyright goes, especially since copyright became automatic when the 76 Act took effect, my guess is that women actually do more creative work. I'll get back to that in a second. So another thing, if you pay attention, or if you have children, or just pay attention to children, is something that's gotten a lot of attention for a fairly long time now, is the fact, really irrevocable, and there's a lot of data to prove it, that boys and men are just less successful in academic environments, that boys start struggling in grade school, by high school, women are outperforming them, and then by college, more women go to college, more women succeed in college, just tons and tons of data. However, despite this fact, men still manage to completely dominate the STEM fields, right, by numbers as well as success. Periodically, there are special programs, usually kind of small scale, but to rectify this, or at least address this disparity, attempts to draw women into the STEM fields. And some small grounds, some of them have been moderately successful, but for the most part, they haven't done anything. But people recognize, there's a social recognition that not having many women or as many women in STEM is a problem, and that's something that society needs to address. On the other side of the coin, however, women completely dominate the copyrightable sort of creative arts, and no one bothers to try to draw more men in. The same disparities we see in STEM is seen as a national crisis, at least by some people, to get more women into STEM. The fact that men are just a fraction of things like art majors, music majors, creative writing, all those majors are overwhelmingly dominated by women. It was like, okay, who cares? There's no effort to draw the men into this or to address the disparity because it's seen as something that's not a problem, apparently. Two exceptions of the copyrightable arts, as I'll call them, and that would be computer science, which of course we know copyrights, especially under Alice, more importantly, and computer code is copyrightable. And then sports, which I'll talk about separately in the paper, and if I get a chance here, which sports is something almost completely dominated by men. So the patent lag appears to be partly a problem with numbers, right? The copyright situation is just odd because men are small in numbers, but they rise to dominate almost all the copyrightable arts despite the smaller numbers. When you drill down a little bit, in STEM, there is one area where women are making notable progress, and that's biology. That in terms of the biology majors and through graduate school, women are starting to see more numbers, and in some cases even a slight majority of women in biology. It's when you ask people why this might be so, it seems less exciting. And that is, it's the lowest paying and the lowest status. And it's hard to know what the cause and effect was. It was lower status, so women felt they could get in, or women got there and became lower status. But some of the explanations have been, it reflects women who have a desire to help people, because biology is sort of a helping science, I guess, as opposed to physics. And women are driven from physics in great numbers, and when you try to evaluate why that is, men say it's some inadequacy in our brains. Well, women will point to discrimination. Women have increased their patenting activity somewhat since 1976. It was around 2.7%, and now it's about 10.8%. So just 10%, maybe 11% at the most, of the patents that issue are issued to women inventors listed. Though where they have the most success, the women who have the most success patenting is in academia. I was surprised by that initially, but I guess it makes sense because in academia, sometimes it can be pretty rough on women, but it probably compared to corporate America, maybe it's a little more free of a space. In any event, though, most of the patents go to women in academia, and there's a negative consequence, which is those are the ones least likely to be capitalized upon, commercialized. The academic patents tend to be, look, we're innovative here, we prove it, we have a patent, but those are less likely than the corporate or government patents to actually turn a profit, maybe make scientists famous, give them startup opportunities, etc. Copyright's a little harder to track. The women, for one thing you can just use your initials as an inventor and patent, but again, the research that was done has been keyed off of first names, like assumptions about first names, because no gender is signified. And that's something I've debated with friends about whether that should be a requirement, and that's actually, I'm going to say yes. But the best argument against that is that if people start using their full first names that are feminine in nature, socially identified as with women, that patent could actually get less good treatment at the PTO. They'll have girl germs that people won't, they'll see the invention is less likely to be successful. Copyright kind of points out what the issue, because copyrights are a little hard to track, and there are opportunities in copyrightable field where women can actually escape their gender, and that tends to make them better off. And one of the classic examples, pretty well-known examples, is musical editions. Female musicians were just held to be just not as good as men. Maybe they didn't practice enough. Maybe they were thinking about boys. For whatever reason, they weren't very good until they started auditioning behind screens. And the improvement the very first time the screens were used was 50%. They were 50% more likely. But even then, it could have been higher, except you could hear them walking across the stage, and you can identify female shoes some of the time, heels. It might have been more than that. So it's a pretty serious. It's an insignificant change. There are other opportunities, for example, writers. So there are many writers who choose to use initials or sometimes even a male pen name to hide their gender, because there's a belief, well, women will read women, men won't read women. The most famous example of that was J.K. Rowling, and it was an actual choice. She'll discuss the fact that it was a choice to be J.K. Rowling. And it wasn't just to be J.K. Rowling. In fact, when she started writing this, the murder mysteries, behind the pen name was Robert Galbraith, but she picked a male pen name then as well. But she made up another larger decision, which was to have her protagonist be male, right? Harry Potter is the protagonist. As other people, but particularly in a wonderful essay, Sadie Doyle writes this story, and she says, you know, Joanne Rowling, and then she says Hermione, because all the Harry Potter stuff, because she said if you dig into the Harry Potter books, it's Hermione that does everything, right? She's not the chosen one. She doesn't have famous parents. She doesn't have a destiny. She doesn't have a fortune in golden ingots, right? She has to work her butt off. Like day after day, she has to be the best which of her age by absolutely putting effort in. And it turns out really well. She saves the day over and over in every book. This is from Sadie's essay. There's a moment when her classmates need to be saved, and they make a plan that's going to save them, and they inevitably turn to Hermione, the brightest witch of her age. Hermione always comes through, though. She has the plan, she saves them all. And then she says sarcastically, that's why her name is on the cover of every book. When you look into every area, and I hope that my paper is going to be able to do this, if you look at radio, the radio industry was built in a way that really kind of oppressed women artists and kept them down. Now there are new modes of distribution, and it's hard to get data about them. Pandora, Spotify, all the ways that you can get music online takes us away from the radio model, and in some ways should be more freeing, right? The radio model is like play a song until you can't stand it, please have to turn off the radio because you've heard that song too many times. And then a few months later, if they purchase what they ran and you hear it, you go, that's a pretty good song, it becomes an old eventually. On the internet, there are these different distribution models, and it's hard to know really what's going on. But one of the nice things about it, I guess, if we don't mind a little privacy invasion, is that better data collection options, right? If there's a way to get the data, we can actually probably see what are women artists doing better in this internet scenario, and what are women consumers doing? We've got more options, and so on. So if there's enough data, that would be pretty good. At the moment, I just said the paper, there's a lot of anecdotes, though, about stuff that happens. And just one of the examples that troubles me the most is Megan Trainor, who wrote that song, It's All About the Bass. And for a while, I couldn't even listen to that, but it's still, I admired her. It's a song about body acceptance, and she got so much pushback that she was like teaching the youth of America that it's okay to be fat when it's the worst thing in the world to be fat. How dare she? Watching that pushback, and I was trying to come up with male examples of the same thing, kind of the body shaming pushback, and I couldn't come up with any. So I'm sure there's got to be at least a few out there, but if you have them, send them to me, because I really couldn't, and none of my friends could. When we get to sports, sports is entirely male, male-dominant, almost entirely male. At the level of like Olympic competition, we like to watch girls who ice skate or do gymnastics, but a lot of them, their career's over by the time they're 17, and there really aren't good professional options. I mean, maybe get an endorsement deal, but no one really wants to skate once you're not little and cute anymore. Computer software, there's actually fewer women than there used to be. There are a lot of women in the beginning founding the field, but they've been driven out, and that's something I'll talk about. I think that's very disturbing. So ultimately, what I'm concluding here, what I wanted to conclude here, I certainly don't blame copyright or patent law for sexism and the sexist society that's here, but I think we need to think more about the way patent law and copyright law sort of commodify these gender disparities. And the solution I propose, at least as a first step, is that gender-based data collections start taking place in both the Patent Office and the Copyright Office. So it's not going to solve the problem in the short term, but at least what we can do is sort of measure and track the problem, and it can expose certain situations that I think we're not culturally aware of. And just as a larger point, intellectual property has a lot of baked-in values, and the main baked-in value that you've probably noticed, or if you haven't, you want to still notice that you'll see that I'm right in a second, is it's all about money, right? But money's not a neutral thing, and then focusing only on money's not a neutral thing. Even some of the cultural appropriation stuff, I read about cultural appropriation or some of those issues that have been addressed, often the solution is money, right? It's been solved with some money, or at least people have been mollified. I really think that intellectual property and what gets profitably commercialized takes a cultural temperature. It's really a vehicle for that. And so I think we need to pay more attention to that. And then just in closing, Mark Lemley was saying last night that I was probably the only person who wasn't going to take a poke at him on this panel. I said, no, I am. Because he's part of this wonderful institution, Lex Machina, that does a ton of data collection. It's incredibly valued, and they've been incredibly generous about giving access to academics. So I appreciate all that. And I'm still going to say, to focus on some of the social stuff, while you're collecting the data, to a larger extent might be a really helpful thing, although people are not going to pay as much for it as they are for trial analysts. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Rob, let me pull up your, you have some slides here?
Yes.
All right, let me just pull that up.
Okay, so I want to thank all the organizers. Claire, if she's still here, all that work to get us here. And you law review folks to spend part of your precious Friday, which at least at my school is partly a day to consolidate your gains from the week. So I appreciate you spending extra time sitting in the classroom, and everybody else who made the effort to be here, and my fellow panelists. So I'm mostly just going to talk about the book that I wrote called Justifying Intellectual Property. And I wanted to kind of frame my discussion partly through Mark's critique, which I think was very helpful in getting me stirred up to think about things, which is always good. Since I wrote the book a few years ago, you tend to get out to the next thing. So it brought me back into it in a good way to kind of focus on the original motivation and themes that I was working on. So mostly what I want to talk about is how I tried to work this notion of pluralism into the structure of my book. And I don't think that that's completely self-evident, and I just wanted to take some time to explain that. The phrase that I use in the book is, there's room at the bottom, by which I mean we can have different foundational commitments about why we might think intellectual property is worth having. We can have different reasons or basic beliefs or commitments about why we have IP. And yet, even though we might disagree at the foundational level, we can have conversations at the policy level, we can have constructive debates, and we can exchange ideas and sort of have a give and take at a slightly higher conceptual level. So this idea is not original to me, but I kind of baked it into my book, and so I wanted to kind of share how I see it as working. And this is in partly a response to the critique, which says that the book is kind of dogmatic in a sense. And I really tried hard not to make it that way. So that's really what's the motivating purpose here. When I talk about the bottom, I talk about these normative foundations, and I'm sorry that the slide isn't that clear. After Anne's talk, I'm ashamed to say that we have dead white males at the bottom. And if I were starting the book again today, I probably would have to rethink a little bit about that. And I was trying to think where commitment to feminism, or where a critical feminist perspective would fit in this, and I'm not really sure. I think it's a different kind of normative take. There's a distributional aspect in a broad sense, I think, to a feminist or a critical race critique. And I did build in a lot of Rawlsian ideas into my book, so I think I could fit it in at the bottom, but it's something I probably need to work on in Theory 2.0. Anyway, most of what I'm going to talk about is these so-called mid-level principles and why I think that's a good forum for the kind of exchange that we're here to have today. So the two competing foundations that Mark and I are commenting on in our written work, these are the old standbys in IP, utilitarianism, or more broadly, consequentialism, where we say, is this institution, net positive when we add up all the utilitarian calculations? We say, is this thing basically a positive for social welfare? That's how we decide whether to have an institution or not, right? That's the basic foundational commitment. And the alternative is a kind of non-consequentialist basket of ideas, sometimes characterized as, I think Anne said, moral rights or moral theory. We could get highfalutin and call it deontological. But it's basically more of a kind of what is fundamentally right and wrong. And it's a rule-based way of thinking about things that looks more at the fundamental value of right and wrong, what the rules dictate that you should do that follow from your moral foundations. So, in terms of utilitarianism, I think the parenthetical after you cite my book, right? The one-sentence summary is, Mergis doesn't believe in utilitarianism anymore. He gave up. That's what it's come to be. And it's tough when you write a long book to see it. I mean, you guys have written a book, Jessica, I hate to say that you'll become the one-sentence summary. You probably already have, and you probably have already learned to resist it and say, that's not it. Anyway, so it happens. Mark, it happened to you with Dan, and it just happens. So anyway, part of the virtue of forums like this is I get to break open that one-sentence summary and say, no, let me explain it one more time before I'm finished. So basically, how I got to the alternative foundations that I got to was not through a kind of a priori rejection of utilitarianism, but just kind of a frustration. If you're in this field, there's lots of empirical studies all the time, and if you follow them, they tend to be kind of a roller coaster ride. Some will say it looks like IP is a net positive for social welfare, and then the next study comes out, and the bottom line is, well, not so much. It looks like maybe in some fields or in some areas IP is not doing anything very useful, and then in some areas it's actually causing some harm. And so I started with the intention and the hope of finding some grounding that I could tote up all the basic efficiency-based or empirical studies and come out with the answer, right? And I just couldn't, and that was maybe my own kind of moral failing. Now I should say at this point that there are two types of people in the world, right? There are intelligent people who take the world as it is, and they are functional phenomenologists. They just say, okay, IP is here, right? And I don't have to think any deeper than that. I didn't make it. I don't have to justify it. It's here, right? Those are smart people. Then there are people like me who say, but why is it here? Should it be here, right? And I bet people say, the problem with you, Rob, is, most of us wait for the subway. And we don't think, why is this stop here? And who made the subway? Was it a good idea? Right? And would tandem bicycle service be? But we don't think about that. We take the subway as it is, right? And you're one of those people who says, no, but I have to think about it fundamentally. And they say, that's an illness, not a scholarly interest. And so here we are. Anyway, so I kept thinking, and I said, gee, if we have this field, I have to justify it. And I can't just be satisfied at that phenomenological level. So that's what caused me to keep pushing, which is basically, what I did. And in this push, I started reading a lot about the sort of philosophy of property rights, and there's a whole literature on why we might have property, and that's basically what I dipped into. I think that there are some interesting, modern variants and updates of this, and I just was not sophisticated enough, to really be able to go into them in great depth, right? I'm not a Locke scholar. I'm certainly not a Kant scholar. So my book is Lockean maybe, or Kantian, but it's not a good place to sort of catch up with the contemporary thinking in Kant studies, because I'm an outsider and I was kind of a junior leaguer coming into it. But I did find when I read all this stuff that they provided to me a pretty good foundation, ethical foundation you might say, of why we have property, and it wasn't based on consequentialist reasoning. You didn't have to make the utilitarian case, so I said, well, that's a good alternative. So I can say, these guys help me, they are guys, I'm sorry, but there they are. They help me to understand why we might have a property-based system, even if we're not sure if the numbers add up. They tell me why property rights are basically a good institution. And then on top of that, there's a whole chapter on Rawls, who talks about the distributional consequences and how we can have property rights in a society which is basically fair. How does property fit in to a society that cares about the fairness for all people? I think that's the level at which maybe feminist and critical analysis can come in. I think that some of what Anne was saying has distributional consequences and has distributional overtones. But anyway, that's how I was led to those sort of foundations. And I try to say in the book that I'm not, giving up on utilitarianism, sort of holding out hope, that someday the numbers will tote up and people like me will be convinced. I think there's a lot of people in this room who are, taking a hand in perhaps making that happen, right? Everybody who does experimental work, everybody who does big surveys, everybody who is training in empirical methods and pushing the field forward. It could be that someday, my book is just sitting there collecting dust on the shelf, and I say, well, that was before Sprigman and Bucafusco and all these other folks, and Wasserman and lots of other people kind of did their crowning career work and persuaded me that IP was either net positive or negative. Anyway, the point is, I'm certainly open to more data. I think that's really my bottom line. So how does this kind of pluralism really work in practice, right? How can you say, well, I'm a Kantian, or I think the reason for this system is basically justified by deontological theory, and yet we can still have an argument about the right contours for fair use, or we can have an argument about how we should structure inventorship in patent law, or what we should do about genericide and trademark. How does it actually work? How do you have a policy level discussion, even though your foundational commitments might be different, right? Well, that's where these mid-level principles come in, and I borrowed the concept from Amy's colleague, Jules, and tried to apply it in a way that will be familiar with those of you who sort of have studied the later John Rawls, who talked about how we can have a liberal political society where so many members of the citizenry have different fundamental commitments, right? How can we, have a debate about the right structure for Social Security when some of us are very committed to Islam, and others are, very strong atheists, and others are committed Catholics, and others are Buddhists, and not to mention lots of other life philosophies, right? How can we do that? And he talked about having this tier where we can pitch our arguments at a sort of public level, or at a level where we're not arguing about our fundamental commitments because we have a shared overlapping consensus about some of the implications or second-order effects that follow from our commitments, right? So here's a little application of this idea of the mid-level to a brief that Mark and I did recently in the Helsin case, right? So we worked on this together, and this just kind of explains how we might disagree and have these two papers that are kind of yelling at each other, and yet have a perfectly cordial and I think very productive scholarly exchange at the level of patent policy, right? And I applied the same thing to another problem in my paper, which you can look at. My time's up. And this is the problem that those of you who study copyright are familiar with. People sign a contract, and they're going to exploit their work in one medium, and then a new technological medium comes up, and we have to decide whether that grant or assignment moves into the new medium automatically, or whether they get to sign a new contract, right? So this is a debate that we have in copyright, and there are a lot of ways we can argue about it, and this is just a kind of schematic about how that mid-level policy argument can go on, even though people might have very different fundamental theories about copyright. So that's really my basic point, is there's a lot of scholarly exchange that can go on, even if we disagree about fundamentals. So, thank you.
I'm going to speak from up here. I don't know slides, but on slides. All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jeremy, for organizing. I'm well aware of my role on this panel, which is as the bad guy, what Julie Cohen would call the econodroid, with an overly narrow conception of right and wrong that can be reduced to numbers. I embrace that to a limited extent, certainly to the extent that I wore my Darth Vader tie. So here goes. If you haven't read Rob's paper, you absolutely should. It is both an effort here in his talk to build a positive framework. It is also a rather pointed critique of my paper, which I think Rob took as a rather pointed critique of his book. I didn't intend it in quite that way. I think what I'm aiming at is something that is rather broader than Rob's book, but I did in fact use him as a jumping off point. What I see is an increasing move towards moralism and away from evidence in intellectual property disputes and in patent disputes in particular, right? And that patent debates that 20 years ago might well have taken place at one level have become in some sense part of the culture war. And if you are anti-property or something else, you are on the wrong side of that culture war. Now, James Grimmelman accused me in my paper, Faith-Based Intellectual Property, of using the language of culture war, and that's probably a fair criticism, but it is certainly not I who started that usage. What I did do, and what I have discovered in the course of writing this paper and watching the reaction, is that while there are very few things in the academic environment that are beyond the pale, apparently one of the things that you cannot do in a modern academic environment is compare someone's thoughts to religion. That's off limits. Now, I will note that I am not the person who originated this idea, right? Where did I get the idea of comparing this to religion? I actually got it from several references in Rob's book, right? Not merely an isolated reference to his faith in intellectual property, but to Rob himself talking about what I think both Rob and I have experienced in recent years as, if you'll forgive the religion perpetuation analogy, a crisis of faith. Right, which is, for several decades now, we've been doing kind of hard-nosed policy, data-based empirical work in the patent system, looking for the evidence of what does the right patent system look like, right? What is it? What's good about it? What's bad about it? How should it look? And as we get more and more evidence, the evidence does not support a good conclusion as to whether or not we should even have a patent system at all, or what it should look like. That's not to say there is no evidence. Fritz Machlup 50 years ago said, we don't have any evidence. If we, on the basis of what we know, we couldn't create a patent system if we didn't have one, but since we got it, maybe we shouldn't get rid of it. We've got a lot more evidence. A lot more evidence, though, hasn't actually given us great confidence that what we've got is anything like the right answer. So the question is, what do you do about that? Right? And Rob and I think, jump in very different directions in response to that. Right? Rob's reaction, which he has ably described, is I want to dig deeper and look for foundational principles that are not evidence, but that are themselves kind of bedrock on which I can base my theory of intellectual property. my view is somewhat different. My view is that if you kind of look at a lot of evidence to explain why we're engaged in a massive regulatory intervention in the marketplace, and the evidence doesn't seem to point in the direction that we can justify that regulatory intervention in the marketplace, well, then we ought to start questioning why we're doing it at all. Now, I don't think the evidence says we should abolish intellectual property. I think the evidence is more complicated, more nuanced, and more incomplete than that. But to me, the fundamental distinction between what Rob does and what I do is his reaction is to try to find a justification for intellectual property that does not depend on the evidence because the evidence is not lining up behind it. Right? Now, I referred to that approach as religion, right? In the sense of not science, right? To me, if you're looking at the evidence and the evidence doesn't support the proposition, you got to start questioning the proposition. I think Rob is questioning the proposition too. His reaction to it is different than mine. It is to look for those other justifications. I accept that those other justifications are out there. I confess that I don't find them particularly convincing as applied to intellectual property, and particularly as applied to modern versions of intellectual property and patent law, right, which engage in rather significant restrictions on other people's autonomy in the supposed service of encouraging innovation. But you can imagine that sort of there are other goals, non-innovation goals, that might be served even by this. I think that if you take the fundamental project of the intellectual property laws as goal-oriented, as utilitarian, as trying to encourage innovation and creativity, well, then we can actually have a conversation about whether or not we're achieving that goal, whether changes in the law would make us better, bring us better or closer to the goal or not. If you don't accept that that's the basis for intellectual property, if you've got some other story for it, well, then it becomes, I think, much harder for us to have a conversation. So Rob, in his paper, accuses me of sort of being a sort of fundamentalist who privileges evidence over other kinds of justifications, and I think that's probably right. I do think, right, evidence is what we ought to be looking for. That, to me, is what makes this inquiry at base a scientific and not a religious inquiry. I should be clear that the evidence we ought to be looking for is a lot broader than economists sometimes talk about. There is fabulous work being done by some of the people in this room on sociology of intellectual property, on the psychology of intellectual property. Rob, in his paper, actually discusses some great examples of evidence that might point us in the direction of thinking that the utilitarian goals of intellectual property might be served, not merely by showing that people will create more if you give them more money, but by fairness, by distributive justice, etc. All of that is wonderful. That's great evidence. That's evidence we can look at and say, okay, maybe here's a basis on which we can justify an intellectual property system. But if your justification for an intellectual property system is not based on evidence, then I think I disagree with Rob about how easy it is for us to have a productive conversation and decide our disputes. So Rob correctly points to the various circumstances in which he and I have agreed and even written together despite our different foundational commitments. I think that's great. That's absolutely right. But the fact that we can agree is not the important thing. The question is, what happens when we disagree? Right? How do we figure out either who's right or even why we disagree? And you can imagine a variety of examples of this. So let's say, for instance, that the evidence starts to show, to a pretty good degree of certainty, that patents on business methods do not, in fact, encourage the creation of new business methods and might, in fact, retard them. Patent owners on business methods say, I am the first person to have created this thing, and I therefore have a moral entitlement to right to exclude other people from free writing or copying on what I have done. I have no idea how I am supposed to choose between the evidence that suggests it's bad for society and the moral claim that I made it and therefore I own it. For that matter, I don't know how to choose between the moral claim that I made it and therefore I own it, and the moral claim that I ought to have autonomy, and as an independent developer or inventor shouldn't be constrained by the government from going into a particular line of business. Now, Rob, I think, tries to get around this by suggesting that what we'll do is we'll have normative ideas that justify our intellectual property commitments, but we'll put them aside most of the time and focus instead on mid-level principles. And those mid-level principles, Rob thinks, can be separated from the deep commitments and the foundational questions. I'm more skeptical. I happen to agree with Rob's mid-level principles. I think they're actually a good and sensible way to think about intellectual property law. But I don't see how one can derive them from the moral foundations of non-utilitarian thought. Right? Why efficiency? Right? Why is efficiency good? I understand as a utilitarian why efficiency is good. I don't understand as a Lockean why efficiency is good. I don't understand as a Kantian why efficiency is good. Why non-withdrawal from the public domain? Again, right, I can come up with good utilitarian justifications for it. It's not obvious, though, that those justifications ought to extend to Locke, right? We try periodically to extend copyright term retroactively. A number of people have said copyright should be perpetual in Congress. Probably it should if you're a Lockean. Or if not, you've at least got to kind of find some sort of clever limitations on Locke, apply a proviso to try to come up with to justify the limitations. We may get to the same end result, and that's great. I think we often do get to the same result, and Rob and I agree more than we disagree in the patent system. But I worry that at the very points where we're going to disagree, we don't have a way to have a productive conversation once we've made fundamentally different normative commitments. I also worry a little bit about the extent to which we can just go ahead and blithely do what I will call normal science. The ordinary work of figuring out, empirical work, figuring out good policy, and so forth. If we don't actually know whether intellectual property is justified or not, we might in fact be doing some good at this mid-level, and it might not matter whether or why intellectual property is justified. But we might also be engaged in making better and better epicycles, right? Holding firm to the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe, trying better and with more accuracy to predict the movements of the planets and the stars, but ultimately engaged in an inquiry that if it's got a wrong foundational base, just isn't going to lead us in the right direction. And that leads me to my sort of final point. Rob says, with some kind of injured justification, I think legitimately, hey, how can you attack me for being dogmatic and religious? This is about as pluralist a book as they come. That is a fair statement, I think, with one caveat. I was a Boy Scout in the 1970s. And so I learned the Boy Scout motto. It's still ingrained in me. What is it? What is a Boy Scout? Trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. 40 years later, I can still recite that off the top of my head. We had a discussion in my Boy Scout troop about the last one, reverent. This bugged some people because there was a pretty high Jewish community in my neighborhood, and Boy Scouts were at base a Christian organization. The scout leader had a very thoughtful discussion, and he said, you know what, actually, the way to understand this is there's not just one path to truth. There are many paths to truth. Right? You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to be a Protestant. You can be a Catholic. You can be a Jew. You can be a Muslim. I don't care, as long as you're reverent, as long as you've got religion. What worries me about these foundational commitments is that they're not ways of asking, should we have intellectual property? They are, at base, ways of saying, what are the different ways in which I can conclude that intellectual property is a good idea? And that elides the question of whether we ought to be concluding it's a good idea at all. So to conclude and to return to Darth Vader, I guess I find your faith disturbing.
So I have the fun of coming at the end so that I get to comment a little bit on what's come before, and then shift into some my own remarks. So I guess what I think is so helpful about the way that Jeremy's framed this panel, and I want to add my thanks for putting this together, is that it highlights what I think of as an important point that we don't often recognize, which is that in fact there are values behind all forms of defense of IP, right? And so I think what I want to push back against a little bit in what Mark was saying was the sort of suggestion that efficiency is over here in a scientific land, and then everywhere else there's something like maybe value or moralism, because efficiency itself is a value-laden concept, right? And typically defended through the rubric of welfarism. So here you'd be staking your claim with Jeremy Bentham, for example, right, and not John Locke, right? But that's a claim. It's a claim that has a lot of deep implications for how you want to think about humans, how you want to think about what we value, right? We value, let's say, preference satisfaction, and that's the right way to think about things, as opposed to, some of the theories that Locke's working around, that Rob's working with. But they're both theoretical, they're both value-laden, and they both require us to make moral choices, right? I guess we want to push back against in the other direction, although I'm not sure that Rob really is suggesting that we move away from kind of empiricism or evidence, is that I think you don't have to move away from evidence by choosing a non-utilitarian theory either, right? And so I would say actually most theories of value are susceptible to evidence, right? So I was thinking here of Anne's point about women inventors, right? And so if you care about, let's say a non-discrimination principle, and it turned out that putting women's names on patents ended up making it less likely that women got patents rather than more likely, like you would care about that. And you would therefore want to adjust how you thought about what you would do, right? There's a lot of, I think, examples we could come up with in that regard. I think even with respect to the question you were asking, Mark, about business method patents, should we have or should we not? Somebody who thought that business method patents actually made it harder for inventors to engage in invention and who cared in a sort of Lockean context about that might say, well, look, I care about the second inventor as well as the first, and so maybe I would want to reject business method patents on those grounds. Now, so I think part of your disagreement, Mark, with Rob, I see as a disagreement with Rob's version of Lockeanism, right? And the idea that Lockeanism is a good value in this context, not sort of science versus faith or science versus value. So I want to then shift a little bit and talk about one value that I am increasingly interested in thinking about that I think is increasingly kind of part of our social conversation, and that I'm curious to think more about how it might implicate intellectual property law, which is the value of equality. Right? I mean, so we're in a moment of, I think, a lot of intense social thinking about and kind of political conversation about the value of equality. And so I want to make sort of a couple of brief interventions about how thinking about equality, if we were to agree, which we'd have to agree, right, at the outset, that we care about equality. If we were to agree that we cared about equality, where might that lead us with respect to intellectual property law and also the kind of beyond intellectual property law choices that we might make? So sort of simple beginning here, right? So if to start off with, we'd have to think about, well, why would we care about equality and how would we know what kind of equality we cared about? I'll just start here with, I think, one framework that is probably familiar to many people, which would be a kind of either a Rawlsian or a Amartya Sen's capabilities framework, right? So in either of those frameworks, let's say, we would care disproportionately, right, from Rawls's framework, about the least advantaged, right? So we would want to pick a system that was to the best, to created the greatest benefit for the least advantaged, or in Sen's approach that tried to create the most universally available basic capabilities for humans. So I think that if you took that kind of, we agreed that those things were values. And I think in this sense, some of this connects to what Anne was saying, right? And that we do actually share a collective moral sense, although, again, people can disagree with that. We share those as values. What might that mean for IP law? So one thing I think it would mean, and I've written a little bit about this elsewhere, is that it would mean that we have to look beyond IP law for other modes of generating and then determining who gets access to information goods. And why is that? That's because of, I think, some of the basic features of IP as a market-led system for both developing information goods and then distributing them. So when we use intellectual property, markets are going to determine both who gets access to goods, and they're going to determine what goods are created. Right? And that, I think, is problematic from these kind of, say, equity-based perspectives, because in the most simple way, markets are going to encourage goods to move to people who have high ability to pay, not just willingness to pay, and because they are going to encourage the creation of goods for people who have high ability to pay and not just willingness to pay, right? And this is the fundamental, I think, mistake of a lot of the moral credit that's given to economics, right? Moral credit given to economics is something about social welfare kind of matches what markets do. But that's only true if willingness to pay and ability to pay bear some relationship to one another, right? But of course, they often don't, right? And in that context, any system that's going to rely on markets to give signals about what we produce or who ought to get access to it is going to undermine, I think, in a fairly straightforward way, the interests of the least advantaged in our society. So if you think about this, and a couple of examples here, you might think about the needs of say, the print disabled. There's been a very interesting conversation at the international level, a new treaty about access to works for the print disabled. So again, from a sort of sending perspective, you don't have to be entirely thinking about equity with respect to how much money people have. The capabilities approach in particular gives you ways to think about things like disability. But we would care about the fact that people, in fact, couldn't create large enough markets, which is one of the reasons that we have this global treaty, right? There aren't large enough markets to have created for earlier on through Braille translations of things, right? So there's a lot of neglect of the needs of the visually impaired. So we need other kinds of mechanisms, whether that be the state, for example, or other forms of social investment through the commons, through foundations, for example, in creating the things that people who are particularly disadvantaged need. You can think here too about remedial education. It's harder to think of examples in the copyright context, but I think that were we to investigate, we could come up with more. And the examples are easy to come up with when you think about the area that I work in more often, which is drugs, right? And in fact that, for example, if you rely on the market alone, you get fewer drugs that will advantage those who have the least. It's very plain at a global scale. Right? I also think, though, it's probably pretty true on a domestic level. In the domestic context, a lot of this is mediated by insurance, right? And so we do have actually second or sort of third-party payer systems that help ensure that where there are diseases of the poor in the United States, people get some access to them through insurance, and so they're created. But in fact, one of the things I've been working on quite a lot is issues about access to medicines in the United States now. And it's very, very clear, actually, that high-priced medicines are less available to the poor, right? So on the access side, maybe we get the medicines, in part because the rich and the poor in the United States largely get the same diseases, but we don't get very good access to them. So you probably all heard about these hepatitis C drugs, which are extraordinarily expensive, $84,000 for 12 weeks of treatment as a list price, right? I've been doing a lot of empirical work, and it's very plain that people who are well insured are getting reasonable access to these drugs. It's improving. There's still a lot of problems, but people who are getting almost no access, prisoners, people on Native American reservations, and actually until now veterans. So that's I think a way of making a little bit more concrete the intuition that market-led mechanisms have really profound disadvantages from a distributed perspective. Okay. So one move I think we might make then is to say, well, we ought to be thinking more about other means of promoting, let's say, innovation that are not market-led, because they might both, on the one hand, help us identify social needs that we care about collectively, but that markets don't well represent, and because they might allow us, that once things are developed, to better distribute them to people, because they're not going to rely on the market either for what gets created or for the question of how things are distributed. So let me say something else about this. The second point that I wanted to make here is I think that equity could also give us a different way of thinking about some aspects of intellectual property law itself, right? So rethinking some aspects of IP law as embodying commitments to equity and reorienting others so that they might better reflect our concerns for at least for law. So one way to illustrate this is when you think about limits of the scope of patentability, for example, or many other areas where IP law is limited, even the idea expression distinction, right? You might be able to think about these as areas that mark off a commitment to a kind of distributive equity. right? Not only because no rights in those spaces may lead less wealth discrimination with respect to access, but also because they leave space where you might have to use social institutions or the state some of the time to create goods, which might in the end then end up more accessible to everybody. So that's not to say necessarily that these gaps alone are going to satisfy the requirements that we might have when we're committed to equity, but that they might play a role in the construction of such a system. And that it's possible even that our policymakers and courts think about them this way in certain moments. I had a very interesting conversation in my class recently about the limit in the Patent Act on patenting or claims directed to or encompassing a human organism. Right? I think that is the kind of thing that many people think of as having a religious or spiritual component. I think that's very clear, I think also as a matter of the negotiation of that it does. And I think one thing to say is once you recognize that that's true, and if you think that's a reasonable exception, it's partially because you don't think efficiency is the only value in the field. Because if efficiency were the only value in the field, you might think, as some of my students were provoked to sort of, well, wait, I mean, if we wanted better humans, if we wanted designer babies, and people are willing to pay for it, which they probably are, right? Then we ought to be comfortable with the designer embryo, and we ought to be upset about a system that would prevent patentability in embryos, which is in fact how that's been understood. Right? So why don't we do that? Well, one thing might be a spiritual or religious commitment that people have, and that obviously is part of our national fabric. Another might actually be a distributive commitment, right? Well, if we're going to ever do those kinds of things, if there are going to be ways to improve us as humans, and some of them might be not offensive from a religious perspective, let's say engineering embryos so that they don't have certain diseases, right? Then maybe it ought to be done by the public, and maybe everybody ought to have access, and maybe it shouldn't be driven by what rich people are going to want out of their babies, and or who's going to get access to that technology alone. So I think, again, you could think about the big controversy now about, for example, whether or not diagnostic patents are being inappropriately disrupted. Well, I mean, what are the distributive implications of that? I think one way to think about that would be the public has to do it here. And this is an important area of healthcare, the public has to do it. And one thing you might get out of limits on patentability is rich people investing in making the public do it, which might then have benefits for the poor. I don't know that that's going to work out. I would care about the empirics, right? And so here's where I want to say evidence matters to me as somebody who's interested in equity. I'll say one final thing because I know my time is up. There are other ways we could think about other kinds of levers in patent law. One that I'm very interested in is the kind of eminent domain-y government use provision in patent law. I'm writing a long paper related to these Hep C drugs saying we should let the government basically override patents and pay royalty, in part because of my concern about the prisoners, people served by the VA, the Native Americans, right? Where a market-based system that doesn't have the ability to adjust for like extraordinary rent seeking, which is what's happening in the pharma, in the Hep C example in particular, is going to poorly serve in particular communities in our country. And so we need to be able to think about, and I think also defend some use of flexibilities within our law also on those grounds. All right, I will stop there, and I'm really looking forward to mixing it up now with these guys.
Okay, so I look forward to mixing it up too. And we're going to take questions from the audience, but before we do, I want to pick up on a couple of themes here and take the first question. So one kind of inflection point that I think comes out of these presentations is what do we do when we do have evidence that everybody agrees is relevant evidence, but interpretation of what to do in response to that evidence depends on what values you're committed to. Right? So this is something that we encounter a lot. It's the kind of thing that we can encounter, for example, when dealing with distributional questions that have to do with gender, with race, with any other kind of social cleavage that might be the basis of distributional inequities. And we would have to decide, as a matter of policy, how to incorporate those into the policy framework. And I'm curious what people on the panel think we ought to do in those kinds of situations. And I'll lay my cards on the table, as in my view is that that's a political question with a small p, and that we are probably going to have to punch political institutions institutions that we justify through other things other than whatever these values are, but perhaps not, and perhaps I'm mistaken. So I'll just throw that open to the panel. Whoever wants to can jump in and field it in the first instance.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. Maybe try to tie it together with some of the other things we were saying. So, of course, a lot of times, you know, it depends on the strength of the value that is challenged by the empirical data and the persuasiveness of the data itself, right? So you can think of examples. I used one in my paper. This is a classic critique of utilitarianism. If it turned out that we could somehow enslave a small group of creative people to churn out novels for us, you know, romance novels or spy novels. And imagine these people are not thrilled with life. They're willing to keep writing so we don't kill them. And they're very unhappy. Right? It's a pretty small group, but they're giving all of us extremely cheap fiction. And there's a massive market for that, we know. And let's say we just ran the numbers and we said, I'm really sorry, you know, to you guys who are producing this, but it's just a net positive for society. You're really hurting, and we understand that. But there's an enormous number of people getting access to really cheap entertainment, and that just outweighs it. And I think most of us would say, we can't do that. That's just outrageous. We can't do that to people, no matter how much joy or pleasure we get out of it, right? So there, you know, I think the answer kind of feedback on some of what Amy was talking about. You know, that's a value. We have a value about access to information, but it's not the only value. You know, the autonomy rights and the civil rights of these producers are important too, and so we would have to weigh them. But it's just another way of saying that, you know, we always throw into a much bigger cover the empirical data that we're talking about, and we say how much of a threat to a value is it and how strongly held is the value. It's a way of saying that's how we work out your political solution, Jeremy, is we put all this in a hopper. We come up with a system that we all agree with, that we will accede to by way of making a binding decision. And, you know, it may not thrill us, but, you know, all the time, but then we live with it because enough of us, for our own reasons, value civil society and that kind of thing. So it's just, you know, it's a balancing act. And it depends on the strength of the value and the type of evidence.
So I would like that to be true, but I worry that it's not. Right? And I worry that it is not in precisely the set of cases in which we have made a core moral commitment rather than a sort of contingent cost-benefit commitment. All the psychological literature suggests, right? Once I've got something that is a belief, right? Not sort of a fact about the world that I might think I know or don't know, but once it has risen to the level of a belief, it is essentially impervious to evidence. And I think we see some rather striking examples of that in the modern debate over climate change, right? Where there's just not, you know, there aren't that many things in the world, right, that there's just not any real evidentiary question about. This is one of them. And yet you've got a whole bunch of people who have made a moral commitment effectively to not believing in climate change, whether because it's a moral commitment to the sort of world they want to live in or the role of government they want to have, and they become impervious to that evidence. So I would like us to be able to engage in that evidentiary balancing, in which we say, okay, you know what, I wanted to believe strong in this value, but it sure turns out that it sure looks like the evidence is pointing against it, so I'm going to change it. I worry that we're not actually hardwired to do it. We don't do it very well. And so one of the reasons, and it doesn't have to be utilitarianism, although I frankly have a hard time finding ones that don't in the end come back to utilitarianism. But one of the things that I want about a science-based view of the world is that skepticism, is that openness to revising one's preferences, one's beliefs in response to the evidence. That's what I fear that we lose as we become more dogmatic in sort of committing to here's why I believe in this.
Anybody else want to chime in on this?
I think Chris does.
All right, so let's move to the audience. Chris, go ahead.
Okay, so Rob, you think of the deontic theories as a foundation, right? I often think of them as like at the top. You've modeled them as being at the bottom. And I guess my question is, to what degree is it necessary that the deontic theories reach up So in other words, what degree of correspondence is necessary for you to be satisfied that IP is adequately justified? What degree of correspondence between the foundational theories and these mid-level principles that we can agree upon is necessary? So to be satisfied with your structure, do you need to be able to elucidate the mid-level principles from the foundation, or is that not necessary?
I think consistency is required. I think in many cases, they will logically follow, or in a kind of sequence that makes sense. So, for example, not the kind of shorthand version of Kant or Locke that says, I made it, so it's mine, but the full-blooded version where we think about the provisos as important as the appropriation principle, and we think about Kant's universal principle of right, which is really all about balancing and not just privileging the creator or the property owner. But so when you look at it in that full-blooded kind of way, the limitations and exceptions in IP are just as consistent with that set of commitments as they are for the consequentialist theory, which says, well, we have to balance production and access, right? So consistency is definitely required, but I think there's even a higher level. Coleman calls it consilience, which is sort of above consistency, but not necessarily all the way to, logical syllogism conclusions. It's more than consistent and tightly bound, is maybe the way. But I think that those mid-level principles are tightly bound with many different foundational commitments. That's why they basically work together.
Okay, so I think we had Hao-Chen, and then Chris, and then Irene, and then in the back, sorry. Hao-Chen, please.
Okay, I have a question for Rob and Mark. So my question is about whether it is possible to apply the idea of public interest or the common good to align different kinds of values that you have talked about. So, efficiency and the value, of course, it deals with the common good, the public interest. We should disseminate, for example, as many works as possible to the public. And but Locke's idea of private property or IP, maybe IP, also has this kind of public interest and common good embedded in its in this kind of theory. For example, the sufficiency proviso, which says that private property should be okay as long as there is good and enough things left in common for the public. So I've been wondering, whether we can apply the idea of public interest to deal with different values. And then the follow-up question would be, hey, what is the nature and scope of the public interest, of common good? What are they when we talk about public interests? And so I think if we're clear about this idea, then we can move on to find evidence to measure whether any sort of intellectual property arrangements are actually promoting the public interest or the common good. And I got a question for Amy. I'll be very quick. Okay. I totally agree that equality should be regarded as a fundamental value for IP, and I've worked on this idea as well. So you mentioned about the application of the difference principle to the application of equality as fundamental value. So there's one particular idea I'm really interested in. It's about the definition of the least advantaged people, or the most disadvantaged people. We should distribute goods to them for their benefits. So I've been wondering, you mentioned about this idea, so I've been wondering about how can we define the scope of the least advantaged people or the most disadvantaged people. It strikes me that Rawls applies income as he sees income as a measure to define the scope of this group of people. But it seems that, for example, I can print disabled people as an example. There might be people who live in the Upper West Side or Upper East Side. They're blind, but somehow they have a lot of economic resources. So should we count them as part of this group of people? And there's another.
Okay, I want to wrap up the question because I want to.
So how can we define the scope of this group of people?
so why don't we start with the public interest one? So this to me is an easy question, right? And so the point of utilitarianism is precisely this, right? The goal is to try to figure out how to best achieve the public interest. It doesn't mean we're good at it. It doesn't mean we'll ever be good at it. But it's exactly the goal of a fundamentally utilitarian view of intellectual property, that we're trying to achieve the common good. And I think one of the interesting questions for the deontological stories that I've never heard a satisfactory resolution to is, right, are we willing to depart from that in the interest of your deontological commitment? And if not, then I think you're doing utilitarianism. And if you are, then it seems to me worth explaining, well, why it is that we're going to make the public worse off to achieve that commitment.
Amy, I think there was a question directed at you in there.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I'm sort of being deliberately vague between somebody like Rawls and somebody like Sen, right? So I think for Sen, that, because he's interested in capabilities, I think the print disabled, for example, and trying to address their particular needs, what would they need to engage in kind of fundamental human capabilities that we all value, so for example, access to culture or, in fact, intellectual engagement. It would be easier, I think, in the context of the Sen account of what we all ought to have. Sen phrases this very nicely. It was like, the question about equality is always equality of life, right? And so I do think that's a really important question you pose, and I think we might come at it differently under different theories of distributive justice. I guess to say we have to spend some time to think about and then try to agree about what we cared about. I think the end here, like Rob, we find this sort of overlapping consensus where I think income might be one component, but other components.
Okay, so was Brett next? Sure. Okay, Brett, since you.
All right, so two quick questions. One for Rob is, are there mid-level principles that you considered and abandoned? And are there mid-level principles that, if you included in your process, would lead to IP being unjustified? So for example, if we took equality or equality of gender and thought that that was a principle that matched up across different normative foundational theories, suppose you started adding a few to your mix, like human flourishing theories or something, or Sen or something like that, would that tip the apple cart over, and would you be, and how would you go about thinking that through? And then the other question I had was, it seems odd to be talking about justification of the existing IP system as if it's a binary on-off switch. I'm just wondering if you get the panel could talk more about sort of the institutional design questions that we are often struggling with in the IP realm. And so it's not really about no patents or no copyright or copyright. It's about how should we, and it's about patents of different various designs in combination or in contrast with grants and educational systems and other things that are all sort of servicing the various ends, whether it's welfare maximization or it's some mix of normative maths.
So, I just have a piece of that, sort of the focus of what I'm thinking about, which is just to force all this data collection, because I think that could be a huge driver. You'd be able to do something, hopefully, follow one publisher, one publishing house, and just figure out the general basis of who you're publishing, and that might lead you to other stuff that would be directly related to the data, but you might be able to figure out were there male and female authors getting about the same deal, they're keeping the same amount of rights, would be able to find out anything about money or how much they spend on promotion, because it's shocking that you would think, well, a publishing house is going to promote all its books, that's how it makes money, but in fact some decision maker says, well, this book's probably not going to do that well, so we're not going to put a lot of resources here to be able to kind of chart those patterns, and I just think it's a starting place. The copyright registration becoming retooled, and the patent also could lead us to think about some of the questions that you just.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
Missing mid-level principles.
Yeah, missing mid-level principles, right, was the so let me respond on the kind of binary nature point, because I think it's a very good point, right? Is intellectual property justified sort of presupposes some conception of what intellectual property is. One of the things that I try to argue in the faith-based IP paper is not the evidence says we shouldn't have IP, or the evidence says we should have IP. What the evidence says, I think, is it's complicated. right? And it works pretty well in some industries. It works very poorly in other industries. It depends probably on what kind of inventor you are. It depends on who's being motivated. And some legal rules, but not other legal rules, are arguably justified for it. So to me, what that says is the more evidence we collect, right, the greater the policy space we open up to improve the system, because we now know, for instance, these are hypothetical statements, right, that business method patents that aren't actually benefiting the world, or that most of the incentive comes from the ability to prevent copying rather than to prevent independent invention, or to take something that's sort of further afield from kind of economic thought, right, that we're all so embedded with an anti-free riding principle that if we don't prevent free riding, people won't feel they got a fair shake and they won't create. You can imagine sort of evidence pointing in each of those directions that led us to say, okay, not IP is justified in its current form or unjustified, but here's the way we modify it to make it better.
Yeah, I mean, you have this problem with Rawls in the original position, and people in that field we talk about a lot. How do you talk about thinking in a complete abstract before you're an embodied person with a social situation? How do you think about fairness in such abstract terms, right? So it goes. So what I say, my book and other writings is, well, try to imagine imagine any IP system that you can, and think whether your ideal one is possibly justifiable. And if so, then you're satisfying that foundational question. So this is an institution that could be justified, and then you move on to building it. Now, of course, the critique of that, the original position is that we're not kind of, abstract monads, and so thinking about ourselves that way is very artificial. And that really is, in some ways, just an intellectual style. Some people work inductively, and they need concrete stuff to move down from. And not everybody is Rawlsian who likes to sort of, think in the ideal way, meaning philosophically ideal. And so some people just they just rebel at the idea of the original position because it's not how they work. They work backwards from empirical facts and in that sense downwards into the roots of theory, and other people start at the top and work. So it's partly just sort of an intellectual style.
Go ahead,
I
please.
was just going to say, I wanted to ask Rob, the remarks as I was putting together today, I was reading your other paper about distributed justice and copyright, and I was thinking about what that paper, if I could give them one sentence version of it, says that Rawls could defend copyright. And it actually used a lot of evidence, Mark, you might like that part.
So is this one, by the way, which is good.
And I guess it made me wonder why you choose copyright as the thing to study in some sense, because I think it would be fairly obvious from a Rawlsian position that some alternatives to copyright might benefit a Rawlsian point of view a whole lot more. And so in that sense, and I think if you're committed to principles of, say, justice, you ought to be considering some of the alternatives. But I'm just curious whether that strikes you as right, or you think it's just probably not correct that some of the alternatives would do more for a kind of justice perspective than copyright.
Yeah, so this is another, it's a framing question, really. I think my co-author on that paper is Justin Hughes, and we started from this simple observation that if you look at the list of the wealthiest African Americans, a lot of them have their basis, the start of their real wealth is in some kind of copyright-based industry, at least speaking generally. So we started with that observation, and so in that sense, we weren't thinking of locating copyright in a spectrum of alternatives, because we started by noticing, that this was rooted in this one system that we already had. So actually, I have to say, as a plug for the generation of scholars behind me, I think the understanding of IP in context is growing exponentially, right? So I would say it's almost a generational bias that, Justin and I just think in terms of the conventional buckets.
You've got to get with me on the subway platform, where we're like, that's the right subway to be on.
Exactly. So, I think, version 2.0 of that paper is going to have a lot more to say to your work, and Lisa Wallet and other people. Camilla Hurdy, I'll give a plug for my student, who are really thinking of locating IP in a much broader spectrum of policy options, right? And really that paper just shows, among other things, my age.
Okay, Irene, I think you've been waiting for that.
Oh, so I Actually, I think Chris was.
Oh, Chris, you've been waiting longer. I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
So, Amy and Ann, I think so clearly your values are independent of welfare. You're committed to them, I think, independently of welfare in some important ways. What I wonder, though, is in critiquing the kind of market-oriented aspects of IP's welfarism, we get to your values reasonably well by just doing welfarism better, right? Which is to say, focusing less on welfarism as willingness to pay, willingness to accept, as preferences understood in terms of dollars and cents, but welfarism in terms of some other measure, happiness, subjective well-being, something like that. If that does a better job of capturing the sorts of, right, so it still won't capture them independently, right, whatever the independent value of equality or feminism might be, but it might go an awful long way to getting us to IP welfarism that is an awful lot more equal in terms of gender, in terms of disparities, those sorts of things. Would that work?
I think that's right, and I guess I would say that the part of the trouble, though, with the conversation about efficiency in IP is that people, if they go back to the wall and say, actually, I need welfare, but when they talk about it, what they're doing is wealth maximization, and they're really using all the tools of economics, which really don't typically measure welfare. They measure wealth.
Right.
And so, if you're going to ask if that's good or bad, you're going to measure that by sort of how much money is moving around in the economy and what the things are going to the highest bidder. That's wealth maximization. That's not welfare maximization, right? And so part of it is that I think there's some habits of mind in the kind of efficiency world that make it hard to do good welfarism. But they don't have to be there. And I could probably defend all the things I defended on welfarist grounds and not ever talk about Rawls or Sen. There could be differences. I just happen to think Sen's more persuasive than is to say Benthamite. But you could certainly get to much of the same place, especially with the kind of critiques that I'm offering, where like there's such obvious gains with respect to utility, however you define it, for so many people. That's like, I mean, you don't have to measure anything even, right? You could just, and that's largely what happens in the welfare sphere. We're making it up too, but.
Can I just add to that? I agree with everything Amy said, but I think that even within the wealth maximization, even before you go into real welfare and utility, right, there's a dead easy utilitarian case for redistribution, right? The diminishing marginal value of money is a well-established phenomenon, right? It is not as good for Bill Gates to get another $1 billion as to distribute among other people, right? That's just straight out easy. That doesn't mean you want perfect equality of wealth. It doesn't mean you take everything and redistribute it in socialist principles. But I think you can push a lot further than people have pushed, even within the wealth framework, even before you leave the wealth framework, in the direction that Amy's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, my sort of part of the project or direction is kind of removed from that in a sense because I don't know what would be found. So I don't know if the data will be found. I don't know necessarily how people are going to react to the data. There's some things that I think everybody knows, like sports are dominated by men, and no one really seems to care that much, right? So that's not going to be a surprise, and it's not clear that would make any changes. But I think there are other things that people are not paying attention to that you can sometimes make. But it needs a step, though. So just like in my life, I participated in an all-women's race, and they played music at the beginning, and I kept track. All 10 songs I heard were all by male artists. Like, why? It's a women's race. Can't we at least have a women's music? My roller derby team was like playing all this male music. I said, can we have some female music? And it just never occurred to people. So I'm just saying on a broader scale, you have the data, and you can do the interventions. That's what happens.
So I actually want to jump in here because this is a question that I like, and I wonder, and it leads us to some of the later panels for the day, right? And I wonder whether this approach of really thinking hard about utilitarianism from a welfarist perspective, for example, as opposed to wealth maximization perspective, really converts our normative debates into methodological debates, right? What exactly counts as utility or welfare? How exactly would we measure it? Is it even measurable? How do we compare one person's utility to another person's utility? How do we aggregate those utilities across a social welfare function and so forth? Is that productive? It's a serious question that I want to ask, because if that's the move that we want to make, do we think that we're going to advance the ball at all, or we're just going to be reframing our same fundamental debates as a different kind of debate?
I mean, I'll say, for my sake, I think it's very productive, right? Because, you know, when I talk about efficiency as a mid-level principle, What I mean is, once you decide, yeah, I can basically defend an IP system, at least my idealized version of one, it follows pretty clearly that, because resources are limited, it makes all the sense in the world to run the IP system as efficiently as you can, once you decide to have one. So that really, you could come at Chris's question a number of ways, but one way is to say that as long as we're talking about operational IP, we will be very interested in that version of welfare. The argument might be whether that penetrates, quote, all the way down. But for most purposes, that's not really very important. That's something that, we don't have to worry about it very much, because anybody who's committed to any kind of IP system has to take account of efficiency, or should. It doesn't mean it's the paramount value, and that's why we have, competing principles that we weigh against it. But the things Anne is interested in, she wants data. I'm citing data for the idea that there's a universal sense of morality. Mark is all about data. He has pioneered a lot of empirical studies. Amy is a data hound when it comes to the things she's interested in. I mean, nobody, I think, is interested in IP, whatever your justification, is going to be blind to the need for more and better data. So methodologically, I think we all agree, except for whether it goes all the way down.
So I think it's useful, and I think one of the reasons it's useful, even in a world in which we're not going to actually have nearly all the information we want, is that framing it in that terms, right? Framing it in that sort of language allows us to front what assumptions we are making about preferences. Right? There turn out to be a bunch of beliefs, right, that if you start to think about them in those terms, require you to think that people have a certain set of preferences that departs in this systematic way from the market, or in this systematic way from otherwise observed behavior. That gives us a handle from which we can try to start to test and distinguish the ones that seem more plausible as descriptions of the world and less plausible. Not perfectly, but better than if we don't do it at all.
But think about how serious the measurement problems really are, right? And so I think that let's just imagine for a moment, there's actually some empirical evidence that people's happiness is very much about relative benefit versus others. And so if you're just going to measure happiness and you're using survey, it turns out like we could, first of all, that's very hard to do about any specific policy, right? Is to measure how much happiness the world creates. But I'd also think about how far it would take efficiency from the way in which we really use that term in our work, right? Which is, if we created more happiness to destroy our modern economy so that everybody would feel like there were such massive distinctions between humans, and that's what we ought to do. And so IP law, accordingly, ought to be,
we're working on it.
But I think it's just like the empirics become really hard, and it's really radically dissociated from the way that efficiency talk normally works in the field. That makes me, I guess, worry. I think we absolutely should always force people to be talking about welfare and not wealth maximization. But I don't think it's not an accident in some sense that it's so rarely done, because I think it's so hard to do, and it so radically differs from what we actually see as, because what you use to measure is so often money, because you can measure money. You can't measure happiness except with a lot of very intensive study, which in fact is often about most interesting questions for people.
Yeah, and so what ends up happening is that a methodological commitment to those kinds of approaches actually has the effect of privileging some normative framings over others, just because they are more conducive to those kinds of methods. All right, Jessica, you've been trying to jump in for a little while. Oh, Irene, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead. Irene, go ahead.
I wonder whether
Sorry.
what Mark is trying to do, it's really more a method than a value. You want to use evidence, and I think I don't see really a dispute between the two papers, because I think the foundation, the foundational, whether it's the normative foundation or the mid-level principle, really what you're trying to do is say we need evidence, and evidence, my suggestion would be evidence, for what I hear from you, is more quantitative evidence. I think we need more qualitative evidence as well. But I see that more as a circle. We need to try to see what are the principles and then the evidence, and then we need to look at, based on value and policy choices, what are the regulatory framework that needs intervention, for example, for gender disparities, for racial disparities, For other, or for example, for developing countries, disparities, access, not just in the US, but also outside. And that is really more a method issues. But then, of course, then we are brought back to what is efficiency and the price of efficiency. And you know, Amy has written about the cost of price. There is a high cost in price. And I think also in this discussion, sometimes some additional externalities are not considered. For example, what we think is efficient in an IP world become highly inefficient in the environment protection world. You know, more products at cheaper price are extremely damaging for the environment, are extremely damaging for labor standards in developing countries because you don't have, you know, we can't think, you know, just in isolation. You know, more products are made in Vietnam in factories, you know, sweatshops. And how can we tie this all together becomes really the million-dollar question. I asked, you know, I've done work on IP and diversity, and all these diverse values, how can we reconcile them? The question I was asked by Joseph Strauss, you know, of course, an IP maximalist, was, are we asking too much to IP in this context?
So, yeah, we're running short on time, so this is going to be the last question, but we're going to continue the conversation in the hall afterward. But does anybody want to have a short response to that?
Yeah, just a quick, so, I mean, I see from my perspective what you're saying very problematically. So if I'm right that more books, more novels, let's say, are written by women than men, but then it turns out that those written by men perform better, well, what does that mean? They perform better because they sell more copies. So I could ask the question, are they really better? You know, or maybe the women's books are just as good, maybe they're even better, but our definition of a good book is one that sells a lot. So how do you know, so it's like a circular problem where I have to say, well, let's have some other standard of good, and that's like a pretty big project, because I read books and disagree with my friends on whether it's a good book all the time, but the standard of a good book is counterintuitive.
Yeah, they can. I mean, you can do more than just does it sell better, right? We got prizes. They may have their own male-female problems, right? Maybe you got to have all authors right behind screens, right? Get rid of the first names. That's really not crazy idea. I just wanted to read just briefly. So to me, one of the benefits of welfarism as the way we think about this is precisely that it gives us the opportunity to integrate, right, harms that are external to the IP system, benefits of the external to the IP system, in a way that I don't think a moral commitment to IP, right, government makes certain commitments to people because they created something, that takes for granted that creating something is good, right, in a way that I don't think you would do in a serious welfarism environment.
Okay, so we have run out of time, but obviously there's a lot more conversation to be had on these topics, and I'm sorry for those who didn't get to ask their questions, but hopefully we can continue the conversation out in the hall during our coffee break, which is short. We've got essentially 5 minutes before the next event. So go grab some coffee and come on right back in. It's just right down the hall. And join me in thanking our